The GA Museum remembers Bloody Sunday. Welcome to the third in our series of Mondays at the Museum playbacks. This recording is of Dr. Ciara Chambers' lecture titled The Propaganda of Partition, coverage of the War of Independence and Civil War in Cinema Newsreels, which was recorded live on Microsoft Teams. Enjoy this brilliant lecture.
So good evening, everyone, and a big thank you to Gillian for inviting me to participate in this lecture series. It's been fantastic to see the different topics covered, and I hope that this evening I'll add a slightly different perspective, if technology allows, that is. I'm going to talk about how this very complicated era in Irish history was covered by Cinema Newsreels. So this brings the added complication of needing to show you some images and some clips. So hopefully the technology will be kind to us and you'll be able to see a series of intertitles from the newsreels and also some moving images. So as I talk through the various events and how they were covered, you should see some imagery on your screen, and hopefully that will stay with us all the way through. So this has been an area of research interest for me for some time. As Gary mentioned, I wrote a book, Ireland in the Newsreels, a few years ago, and that was then made into a television series. I worked with an independent filmmaker, MacDara Curran, who's based in Galway. We were funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland, and that series screened on TG Cahir. And so in working through this research interest of mine, it's been fascinating to chart how the various newsreels covered different events in Irish history and really misunderstood in many cases Irish politics and really struggled to represent Irish stories. So some of you might be familiar with Cinema Newsreels and perhaps others not so much. So I'm going to set the scene by showing a brief clip from the opening episode of the series explaining the significance of newsreels for audiences in the early part of the 20th century.
These scenes were filmed by Pathé News cameraman William Dean, and you're about to see the pictures he got when the ship exploded. Those aboard leaping for life from a flaming inferno, the actual crash of the Hindenburg, an airship destroyed in less than half a minute.
A series of catastrophes ended by a fashion show. Sinead hug an nachar Americanach Oscar Levant nocht sconáin na pectorlinne. Cé go bhfuil cáine agus sciig airis dumta na nocht sconáin, ní ra éon bailach eile ag a bobbal nuíochta eáil an scáileán sa chéad leag an isisiú céad. Bhí an tionchoracab agus an tóirarú.
Nuair leis man fachal sin nuach scanan na nniu, an chéad rud rihin lom na star na tíre seo, star an céad cogadánda, star an dara cogadánda.
Níor war ein tionscail nocht scanán in éireann, agus ba vinnig locht nochta na Breataine nó Verica a freastal an locht fechanna in éireann.
No, afid le héan inse staire eile catú bheith cuaramach a daileáil leo sé sin rá cean fágur bailí ré seo seachas rud éigean eile. Cean cospóide bhíleiste daoine a bhhailigan stop seo agus i léirige.
Léró an trá seo mar a phlé agurthirí nocht scanán leis na scéalta ba bhú in éireann, ribh an neamhsplachas agus ina dhia. Ní gúnaí a hic siad an réimse leathan díalteachtaí politúla ag a locht fechanna.
Republic, is it? Let them try and get Ulster into the Republic if they want a fight in their hands. Ulster's loyal to the King, God bless him.
Fisrófar na bailí éagsúla léire cólachtaí nochta na Breataine an túisceart agus an deisceart. Agus an léirú eile fad a thug an cúpla nocht scanán dúchasach.
Bhí nuacht agus bhí beocht haar cuimse bhaid leat nar hangad ar amach. Fún siad get a spíine.
So newsreels were the only form of on-screen news available to audiences before the advent of television. They tended to back up stories that were covered in newspapers at the time. So people would read about stories, they might hear about them through word of mouth, and then they went to the cinema and saw cinema newsreels representing events that they really were already familiar with. And in many ways, this is a little bit like our lecture tonight, because there's a very slight delay in what I'm saying to you and what I'm showing to you, and it coming through on your screens. There's about a 20 to 30 second delay on that. So just to bear that in mind, if you'd like to ask a question, it's probably a good idea to type it into the Q&A just whenever it occurs, and we'll come to the questions at the end of the session. So as the newsreels were exhibited in the collective setting of the cinema, which was, of course, a place of entertainment, this meant that the newsreels operated self-censorship, avoiding material that was sensitive or controversial. Cinema owners didn't want their audiences upset on an evening or an afternoon out, and of course there was always the chance that children could be present at screenings. So this meant that newsreel producers were really cautious with their content. Newsreels were associated with the birth of cinema. The Lumiere brothers, pioneers in developing early cinema in the 1890s, produced actualities and topical films, and these depicted locations and events, and they were really popular with audiences. So gradually these films became more structured, and in 1909, Charles Pathé, founder of the famous French Pathé Company, issued the first recognisable newsreel, although the term wasn't coined until some time later. So newsreels were, of course, silent at this time. Before the advent of sound, intertitles were used to describe the action on screen, and this made international distribution possible because it meant that intertitles could be easily spliced out of a reel of footage without altering the actual footage itself. This was very important in terms of sharing global events just before and during World War I. And by this stage in 1914, the international newsreel industry was very firmly established. So Ireland was on the British distribution circuit, and there was hardly any local production. So audiences watched news that was mostly produced by British newsreel producers, sometimes American, but it was certainly not a local perspective that was being provided on Irish stories for cinema audiences. The lack of local production was addressed by a short-lived company called Irish Events, and they produced sporadic newsreels between 1917 to 1920, and their tagline, interestingly, was British for the British, Irish events for the Irish. So it was acknowledged even then that the local news perspective was really very important, and the lack of it constituted an absence for Irish audiences who were grappling with really complex local politics. Sadly, Irish events didn't last very long, so the momentous events of the War of Independence and the Civil War were largely covered by British companies, which were selective in their reporting and sometimes actively misinformed audiences, as we will see. What was evident in British newsreels as a pattern was a partitionist mentality that really started before partition and continued in the decades after. So Ireland was very much constructed in terms of north and south constructed in the newsreels. So north and south were represented very differently. Occasionally it suited to suggest that north and south were working together, as we can see from this propaganda film from World War I, which stated that soldiers from throughout Ireland were working closely together in the war effort. And if they could put their differences aside to work together in a larger conflict, then perhaps they could put their differences aside when war ended and home rule became a hot topic once again. This was misleading, of course, since volunteers from north and south from the Unionist and Nationalist communities fought in different regiments. And as was often the case with newsreel coverage of Ireland, there were very different responses to the war that weren't covered when the soldiers came home after the war. Very different responses in both communities, and of course this was not part of newsreel coverage at the time. This film actually appeared in two versions, one in 1916 and one in 1918, and the version in 1918 was simply called With the Irish at the Front, and it appeared just after the Easter Rising, and it was meant to assure audiences that there were lots of Irish soldiers fighting in the war, and that there was a larger global conflict going on, so that there was Irish support for the war effort, which again was misleading and complex in terms of how that story was covered. In 1918, the footage used in the first film was repackaged and footage was added of the 36th Ulster Division, and there was this suggestion that North and South were represented and working together in terms of Irish soldiers. So there's a sense that both Unionists and Nationalist volunteers were working together in the global war effort. That newsreel appeared in 1918, just the war was about to end, to again suggest that if these soldiers could work together in the war effort, then surely they could put aside their differences during peacetime when home rule was going to be part of the agenda again. So this film has a very specific propaganda agenda to encourage a sense of unity in supporting the war effort, rather than portraying the complex sensibilities associated with the war in Ireland. The same was true of coverage of the Easter Rising, which reported on the damage done to Dublin's architectural heritage and reminded audiences that there was a larger global event occurring in the form of World War I. So again, the agenda was not to report the reasons behind the rising, but to suggest it was ill-timed and showed a selfish insularity on the part of some sections of the Irish community. So again, we don't get complex political analysis here. We get a very reductive representation of events in Ireland and very much a kind of pro-British, pro-establishment agenda. So in general terms, in the 1910s and 1920s, the North was associated with the monarchy, with royal visits, with the iconography of Unionism, particularly through depictions of Orange Order marches and rallies. The North was also seen as a place associated with industry and progress. So this short section is footage from a Unionist conference at Liverpool just before the signing of the treaty, which we'll come back to, but it's very clearly pitting loyal Ulster against rebel Sinn Féin. So the newsreels were full of these separations in terms of how Irish identities were constructed. So through the events of the Easter Rising, the War of Independence and the Civil War, there was a focus on the damage Ireland was inflicting on itself, particularly in depicting smoky shots of conflict and damage to buildings. So the south of Ireland at this time is represented during the first half of the 20th century really as agricultural and rural, as opposed to the north, which was associated with shipbuilding and other industries. There were huge challenges for the British newsreels in depicting Ireland's fight for independence. Firstly, the newsreel editors were beholden to British ideals and values. Often they didn't understand the differing political viewpoints in various parts of Ireland, and that these sensibilities were subject to change over time. So they really struggled in representing Irish stories. Take, for example, the funeral of Thomas MacCurtain, Lord Mayor of Cork, in March 1920. Coverage of his funeral by Pathé failed to mention that he had been killed by British forces, which is quite an important fact to leave out. But of course, the British newsreels were very wary of mentioning any details that might be seen to be critical of the British military. Similar coverage followed with the reporting of the funeral of MacCurtain's successor, Terence MacSweeney, in October 1920. So Terence MacSweeney was arrested by the British for sedition, and he died in Brixton Prison in October 1920 after 74 days on hunger strike. So here you'll see Lord Mayor of Cork dead. Cork was outwardly calm on receipt of the news, but military patrolled the city unceasingly. The intertitle sets out a very clear message here. There's no context given. We're not told what has happened here. We're not told about the background of the events. There's just an assurance that the British military are keeping things under control in Cork. So again, a really pro-establishment, pro-British agenda that was designed to assure audiences in both Britain and Ireland that the British were maintaining a level of control during the War of Independence. This lack of context went even further in December 1920, particularly the night of 11th to the 12th of December 1920, as you'll see in this topical budget film, and the British identity is very clearly branded there. Ireland's agony, desolation follows mystery fires in Cork. So there's no mention here that the fires were not so mysterious to Cork's residents. The Black and Tans and the auxiliaries set fire to Cork as a reprisal for an IRA attack, and they also stopped firefighters from tackling the blaze. So this would have been known on the ground in Cork, but of course it wasn't covered in the newsreels. What we get here is an attempt to suggest that this is a mystery fire and to look at the damage that is done and to look at the aftermath of the event. This was the largest single incident of destruction carried out as part of an unofficial reprisal policy by Crown forces in 1920. So it's quite extraordinary that we can see the damage inflicted by this incredible event, but we don't get to hear about the perpetrators of the attack or the reasoning behind what happened. So given this lack of context, it's probably no surprise that there was no newsreel coverage of the Croke Park attacks of Bloody Sunday in November 1920. It seems absolutely astounding to think that the newsreels would ignore such an event. But of course, there are two reasons for this. One is practical. There was no footage taken by the main newsreel companies at the time because, of course, they weren't always in the right place at the right time to capture unfolding events. But the other is very much political. How would it be possible to report on the event without implicating the British military in murder and bloodshed? The newsreels did, however, report on the funerals of the British intelligence agents, the members of the Cairo gang, who were killed on the morning of Bloody Sunday. So there's no context given again in this coverage, and you'll just see the intertitle there. There's just a setting up, an intertitle at the beginning of the item describing the murdered officers. So you'll see how selective the newsreels were in their coverage of events at this time, and that always there was a sense of protecting the British military and protecting the reputation of the British military in these newsreels. So this taps into a broader pattern where very specifically the bad behaviour of the Black and Tans often went unreported. This was because Chief Secretary in Ireland, Hamar Greenwood, continued to deny any wrongdoing, so much so that the phrase telling a hammer became a new description for lying. When he eventually had to begrudgingly admit that there had been some unruly behaviour by the Special Forces, then the newsreels reported Greenwood's comments on the Black and Tans. But while they did sometimes mention the war of reprisals, many incidents were just too controversial for them to report. So you'll see already the coverage at this stage is really very skewed. The newsreels were really more interested in representing the Irish as inherently violent and suggesting that they were willing to self-destruct and turn on each other in pursuit of their political ideals. So the narrative was very much the Irish are the problem. We see this in particular in this item, Sidelights and Sinn Féin. Here we have a condemnation of those who mistreated May Connolly, as you see here, simply because she spoke to members of the British forces. So this is a really convenient way to highlight violence by the Irish towards their own during the conflict. But it also speaks to a larger problem that we are now learning more about, and that was the violence suffered by women during the War of Independence and Civil War. Violence from both Irish and British quarters. So this is a striking example of the significance of a news story from 100 years ago and the significance that that news story can have for current debates about gender and issues of power and also marginalised moments of history. These newsreels have resonance. There is more to be learned from them. And that's why excavating newsreels is really important, because it gives us access to the material and also offers context as a guide to what the newsreels were and how they may have been misleading for audiences of the day. So as well as ignoring or misreporting events, the newsreels had their approach to what we might call spin. We can see this in coverage of the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in December 1921. So you'll see in this intertitle here already, topical budget, with a very optimistic outlook. Irish Free State, after centuries of strife, Britain adds a contented new dominion to the crown. So you'll see how some viewers in some cinemas might have objected slightly to the tone here. And particular with Pathé, we have a similar optimism in their coverage. Peace Council at the Palace, splendid news, says the King. His smile reflects the Irish sunshine. So this coverage of the signing of the treaty in December 1921 is really interesting. Here we see the delegates looking very collegial. We see the King, we see David Lloyd George. There's no sense of the protracted and difficult nature of the negotiations. Instead, we get this really optimistic account. Number 10, where the peace was signed. Here, there's a sense that this is the solution, the welcome agreement. And we see the agreement there and all the signatories. So this suggests that the Irish problem has been solved. We also get to see the Irish delegates, perhaps not looking quite as relaxed, as the British delegates, but there really is no sense of what was going on behind the scenes here, and that the treaty was about to plunge the country into civil war. So we have Michael Collins, we have Robert Barton, we have Gavin Duffy, and we have Arthur Griffith depicted here. And we even see Collins laughing and joking, and yet he said he felt that he had signed his own death warrant. And 8 months later, the newsreels would be reporting on his funeral. So this is very interesting coverage of the signing of the treaty, with a very pro-British spin on that story. Now I'm just going to jump forward a little bit in time and show you how that film, Peace Council at the Palace, was used in the Ken Loach film, The Wind That Shakes the Barley. So there's a really interesting cinema sequence here where we see some shots from Peace Council at the Palace, and we watch an audience watching this unfold before them, and we get a sense of their reaction, which was probably pretty accurate in terms of how Irish audiences might have reacted to hearing about the news at the time. So Loach combined some of the iconic shots from the newsreel we've just seen, Peace Council at the Palace, with segments from other newsreels released over several months to form his own sort of hybrid newsreel, to which he adds some newly written intertitles to provide narrative cohesion. The result is a compendium of footage about the Irish situation, neatly conveyed through the manipulation of real archive footage. So Loach's appropriation of the footage is not strictly accurate here, and certainly leads viewers to believe they are watching an authentic news report from December 1921. This might draw the scrutiny of archivists who can spot the knitting together of footage, but the average viewer will of course not notice that this is a combination of footage. The images are presented much in the spirit of the original exhibition conditions. A cinema with packed audience, listening to the standard musical accompaniment of the silent era, alongside the voices of literate patrons announcing intertitles for those who could not read, and also the loud responses of viewers to the images unfolding before them. So this is a fairly accurate representation of an audience at this time. However, audiences were seldom informed about events via the cinema in the early 1920s, and indeed the newsreels tended to provide moving images depicting events that viewers were already familiar with through newspapers and through word of mouth. With an event as significant as the signing of the treaty, audiences would have most certainly had prior knowledge through the dissemination of information by the Irish delegates. So Loach's historical borrowing offers an interesting aesthetic intervention into the narrative, accurately representing Irish dissatisfaction with the conditions of the treaty and offering the extra diegetic audience, the modern viewer, a perspective on the conflict in store for the viewers depicted within the frame. So it's apt here that the modern viewer watches the audience in 1921 watch newsreels that aren't exactly accurate. So there's an interesting pattern of viewing there. Want to take another slight digression now to talk a little bit about how newsreels covered personalities, and particularly some of the big names of the day like Michael Collins and Eamon de Valera. So here you'll see Collins in Grand Parade in Cork addressing huge crowds. The intertitle flashed by very quickly there, but it states, "Great Cork Treaty Meeting. Mr. Collins receives enthusiastic reception from the huge gathering despite salvos of shots from a few malcontents." So this, surprisingly, is the newsreel's endorsement of Michael Collins, suggesting that he is pro-treaty and that he is largely supported. He has these huge crowds listening to him, and there are just a few unhappy with the treaty, just those few malcontents listening. In spite of the havoc that Collins wreaked on the British administration during the War of Independence, his position as a signatory of the treaty meant that he could be associated with a potentially peaceful solution to the Irish problem. So here Collins gained credibility in the British newsreels. He's now treated as a figure to listen to and someone who's shown to have a great deal of support within Ireland. And of course, we don't get a sense here of the complexity of responses to the treaty. And again, we don't really get the sense that the country is about to enter into a civil war. With de Valera, on the other hand, he is anti-treaty, and therefore he becomes a villainous figure in the British newsreels. Here he is the extremist putting Irish peace at peril. Here he is leaving the Mansion House after denouncing the treaty. Interestingly, this set the pattern for how the newsreels would represent de Valera for the rest of his career. So for decades in the newsreels, de Valera is depicted as stern, as dressed in black, as dark and dangerous, never depicted smiling or laughing like Collins was. And here you see further evidence of support for the treaty because Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith are wildly welcomed home. So you have de Valera as anti-treaty pitted against the pro-treaty signatories here. And it's interesting that that pattern in terms of depicting de Valera would continue throughout his long career. So because of the respectability associated with Collins, you'll see here a peculiarly melancholy associated with this particular item, which was released after the death of Collins. There was huge coverage of the funeral of Collins, of his death in the newsreels. There was a sense of loss and a sense of concern about the future of the treaty and Collins' association with that future as a pro-treaty signatory. So in this short section that you've just seen, there's a sense of mourning Collins already, looking back at the last pictures that were taken of him, and also that Arthur Griffith too was dead. So two of the treaty signatories were now dead, and there's a lament for that in the newsreels because that's seen as a political loss. Going back slightly to July 1922, again, here you'll see Mr. Michael Collins' desperate fight against irregulars. So there is alignment again to Collins, but there's also a sense here that these remarkable pictures were taken by Topical's cameraman lying on his back in a dangerous scenario under fire. This is a really interesting feature of the newsreels. They were always congratulating themselves on getting difficult to shoot pictures, of putting themselves in dangerous situations, of having to undertake daredevil stunts in order to get exclusive film footage to the cinemas. So there's a sense, especially with Topical budget, of self-congratulations, a really, really congratulatory tone in the newsreels when they speak about their camera operators and the danger that they put themselves in terms of getting great pictures and exclusive pictures to audiences at the time. So there's a real sense of drama here, which of course fits into the newsreel's remit of entertaining audiences. perhaps even more so than informing them, as there's very little exploration of political context given. There's very little consideration of political analysis. So instead, the newsreels at this stage were very set on entertaining the audiences and providing dramatic pictures rather than political context. So as we've seen, the newsreels in general were pro-treaty, so therefore they were more sympathetic to treaty supporters in their coverage of the Civil War. But the notion of Ireland as inherently violent was still there in much of the coverage. There's an overwhelming sense of, look at the violent Irish attacking each other once again, damaging their businesses and their communities. And in many ways, these stereotypes that were associated with cinematic representations of the Irish persist to this day, particularly in relation to violence and drunkenness. So those stereotypes that we associate perhaps more with fiction films were also there in newsreel representations, non-fiction as well. The newsreel's partitionist mentality of the loyal industrial north and the agricultural unruly south continued in coverage after the Civil War into the 1930s and was particularly evident during the Second World War, when the North was shown to be fully supportive of the war effort, even though that in itself was misleading, and the South was shown to be comfortably avoiding the war and was perhaps even open to supporting Germany. Interestingly, German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels recognised that the Irish struggle for independence could be used for anti-British propaganda by the Nazis during the Second World War. So I'm going to take you off in another slightly different direction now. Obviously, as would be the case later during the Troubles, news footage of the Irish War of Independence and the Civil War was screened throughout the world. And as I mentioned before, this was easily done before the advent of sound to the newsreels in the late 1920s, as intertitles could be spliced out of a reel of footage without altering the footage too much and replaced with the language of the country of exhibition. So audiences around the world were familiar with images of Irish conflict. This had some bizarre consequences in terms of how the War of Independence was used as a political story to highlight the colonial abuses of the British. So skipping forward here to World War II, this is a clip from a German propaganda film directed by Max Kimmich, brother-in-law of Nazi propagandist Svengali, Joseph Goebbels. And you'll see how events depicted in the newsreels that we've just been watching are reconstructed here. So this scene features Irish boys being educated in a school under British control, which is designed to assimilate the Irish into British ways of thinking. And some of the boys are just about to engage in an uprising, which coincides with their graduation at the end of the year.
Und so geht mit dem heutigen Tage wieder ein Schuljahr zu Ende. Viele von euch verlassen uns. Von morgen ab seid ihr freie Bürger des britischen Staates und könnt tun und lassen, was ihr wollt. Vergesst nie, dass England euch in der großzügigsten Weise und mit weitgehendster Unterstützung eine Erziehung hat angedeihen lassen, die in der ganzen Welt für vorbildlich gilt. England hat viel für euch getan. Seid euch dessen würdig. Es rechnet auf eure Dankbarkeit. Werdet ein Vorbild für eure irischen Landsleute. Bleibt gute britische Patrioten. Und jetzt verbrennt nach altem Brauch die Bücher und Hefte. Entzündet das Feuer. Es lebe der König!
depiction of street scenes in this film was very similar to British newsreels showing scenes of conflict on the streets of Dublin during the War of Independence and the Civil War. But the film itself, My Life for Ireland, backfired in terms of its propaganda potential because the British in the film, particularly the military, looked very like Nazis, unfortunately. And of course, you also have this strange book burning sequence. So in occupied territories, this was actually decoded not as anti-British propaganda, as it was intended, but as a potential call to rise up against Nazi occupation. So the film didn't quite have the anticipated effect, but it's a very interesting example of how Irish affairs were represented and misunderstood by external perspectives. And a lot of that was based on knowledge gleaned from the images depicted in cinema newsreels, particularly during the revolutionary period. So, as we've seen during the golden era of the newsreels, Irish stories were covered by British and American audiences, British and American companies, occasionally American companies, more likely British companies for the most part. So Irish audiences watched images in the cinema and watched coverage of Irish stories that had very much an outsider's perspective and a very problematic perspective for many Irish audience members. It wasn't until newsreels were beginning to fade from cinema screens with the widespread advent of television in the 1950s. At this stage, news broadcasts became a daily reality for people who had access to television sets. But it was just at this point in time that Ireland got its own local newsreel in the form of Gail Lynn's Arc Erin. So this was an Irish language newsreel that ran from 1956 to 1964. It's a fascinating insight into Irish stories and concerns during those decades. And you can see the Arc Erin collection on the wonderful Irish Film Institute's player. So it's really interesting to see the difference once Ireland starts to represent itself. But sadly, this is coming to the end of the newsreel era because with the advent of television, newsreels had some problems competing with the immediacy of television news, although some of them did still continue to run in cinemas for quite some time. But it's remarkable to consider how Ireland, in a particularly turbulent and complex period in the first half of the 20th century, watched news that was constructed about Ireland by outsiders that failed to understand the complex and nuanced politics involved. So Irish audiences really watched a lot of very propagandist and pro-establishment British newsreels that didn't adequately represent what was happening on the ground at the time. And of course, many audiences knew what they were watching was misleading because they had their own experience of the events that were unfolding at the time. So also in the IFI player, if you're interested in seeing more of the newsreels of the revolutionary period, the Irish Independence Film Collection is a wonderful resource to explore the newsreels of the time. So this is the best place to see news stories related to the revolutionary period. The IFI Irish Film Archive went back to nitrate prints of the newsreels produced at the time and now have pristine digital copies of the material along with really important contextual information available on the IFI player. So it's well worth taking a look. Because when Pathé, for example, first digitized their own collections, going back quite some time, the technology has moved on so much from then that the material that's been digitized as part of the Irish Independence Film Collection is clearer, it's closer to what was originally shown in cinemas at the time, and you can see details, you can see faces, you can see the names of streets, you can see all sorts of details that wouldn't perhaps have been available to see in digitized copies that were made quite some time ago. So it's a really beautiful collection to look at, but crucially it also has really important contextual information on the stories and the way they were presented. So it's well worth taking a look at that. I also mentioned the 6-part series, Exploring Irish Stories in the Newsreels. This includes an episode on Arc Erin. If you'd like to see that, you'll find links on the website irelandinthenewsreel.com. There's irelandinthenewsreels.com, I should say. There are also a series of posts there covering where to find newsreel material, how to research newsreel material, and a few kind of different short sections on how particular events were covered in relation to Ireland. So you'll see a post there, for example, in the Newsreels and the Easter Rising. So if you'd like to find out more about newsreels or how to research newsreels or how to look for very specific Irish stories, you can find information there. There is also a wonderful database called News on Screen that is connected to the organisation Learning on Screen, that includes an index of all British news stories that were produced from 1910 through the 1970s. It does have a few Irish stories missing there, unfortunately, but it is a really great resource in terms of researching British newsreels and for looking for very specific stories. So again, if you're interested in delving into the newsreels, that's another good website to take a look at. So newsreels are important social documents telling us about what audiences of the time were told and shown about events and personalities. With digitisation initiatives, they also have a second life, and new audiences are discovering this material, often in a very different context to its original production and exhibition conditions. We would have been in the cinema 100 years ago watching this together as a group, not on our laptops in individual houses. So there's a real sense of a different context, a different exhibition context in relation to the newsreels. But it's also wonderful that we now have access to all of this material, particularly during this decade of centenaries, so we can review it and consider the context of its original production and what it means for us today. So in many ways, cinema newsreels from 100 years ago share a lot of similarities with modern news on a variety of platforms. There was a tendency towards tendency towards infotainment rather than information sharing, tendency to be dramatic rather than to provide political analysis. There's often a kind of a lack of meaningful political context or information given about the events that are depicted. Some events are completely erased from the newsreel history or not covered at all, like, for example, the attack on Croke Park's spectators, which of course is a hugely significant omission on behalf of the newsreels. And also the newsreels often had a tendency towards celebrities, particularly covering royal visits, for example, which again was problematic for Irish audiences, and also they had a heavy focus on sports. So there was this particular blend of personality, sports, coverage of political events, but without the context or analysis, and that blend became a stalwart of newsreel production. And if we think about that, we still see those patterns replicated in news on a variety of platforms today. Obviously, we have a lot of avenues to consume news today, whereas audiences back in the 1920s could only see moving image news in the cinemas because there was no television even yet. But it's amazing to think that those news values of 100 years ago are still really obvious in a lot of news on a variety of digital platforms today.